What would happen if an entire submarine were destroyed by something its crew didn't even know existed? Imagine being hundreds of meters below the ocean's surface, surrounded by steel, engines, and absolute silence, believing the sea to be your greatest ally, and discovering too late that it has actually become your greatest enemy. That's exactly what began to happen to some of the world's best submariners during World War II. And the story begins on a seemingly calm night in the Atlantic, when an American plane flew through the darkness carrying technology that would change warfare forever. It was June 23rd, 1944. The ocean was calm and the sky practically starless. In the middle of that dark immensity, about 870 nautical miles west of the Cape Verde Islands, a huge Japanese submarine slowly sailed on the surface. Its name was I-52. Inside were 94 Japanese crew members, as well as German passengers and technicians. The submarine carried an extremely valuable cargo: gold, tin, and strategic materials destined for Nazi Germany. That voyage was part of a secret cooperation operation between Japan and Germany, a submarine route used to exchange technology, resources, and specialists between the two Axis allies. For Commander Uno Kameo, the mission seemed to be going perfectly. Just a few hours earlier, the submarine had encountered another submarine, the German U-530, in the middle of the ocean. The transfer of equipment and specialists had been successfully completed. Now, with everything concluded, the I-52 prepared to continue the long journey towards German-occupied Europe. For those on board, the moment conveyed confidence. The submarine was large, robust, and the crew was experienced. Japanese submariners were known for their discipline and skill. Many of them believed that beneath the surface of the sea, they were practically invisible. But that same night, high above the water, a U.S. Navy plane slowly crossed the dark sky. It was a TBM Avenger, a torpedo bomber operating from an escort carrier called the USS Bogue. At first glance, that plane didn't look any different from hundreds of others used during the war. However, it carried something new, something few outside military circles knew about, something that would transform the entire ocean into a surveillance system. While the Avenger was patrolling the Atlantic, its radar picked up an unexpected echo, a contact on the surface. The operators analyzed the data and quickly realized it wasn't an ordinary ship. It was too large to be a small boat and too quiet to be a cargo ship. The pilot slowly changed course, approaching the detected point. When the plane got close enough, the radar confirmed. There was a submarine navigating on the surface. Inside the I-52, no one suspected they had been detected. The logic of submarine warfare had always been simple. As long as a submarine stayed away from enemy ships and dove quickly when detected, its chances of survival were high. That logic had worked for years, but at that moment, it was about to be broken. The American pilot launched flares into the sky, illuminating the ocean for a few seconds. The crew of the Japanese submarine saw the sudden light reflecting on the waves. They immediately understood what was happening. Enemy plane. Within seconds, orders were shouted from inside the steel hull. The submarine initiated an emergency dive, descending rapidly to disappear into the darkness of the ocean. Up to that point, everything still followed the traditional script of submarine warfare. Planes detected submarines on the surface, submarines dove, planes lost contact. That's how it worked. But something different happened that night. Instead of giving up the chase, the American plane began dropping small objects into the ocean. They didn't explode, they didn't make a sound. They just fell into the water and floated silently. From the Japanese submariner's point of view, the ocean had returned to silence. The I-52 dived ever deeper, believing the danger had passed. Inside the command cabin, the men probably breathed more calmly again. Darkness and depth had always been a submarine's best allies. But what they didn't know was that those small devices floating on the surface were listening to the submarine's every movement. Up there, on the American plane, an operator put on his headphones and began to listen. First came only the sound of the sea. Then slowly something else emerged, a rhythmic noise, a repetitive metallic sound, the submarine's propellers. Suddenly, The operator was able to track every change of direction the I-52 made underwater, every maneuver, every escape attempt. The submarine believed it was invisible, but to the Americans, it was practically drawn on a sonic map. At that moment, unknowingly, the Japanese submariners had entered a new era of warfare, an era in which hiding in the ocean no longer guaranteed survival. But there was a question that no one aboard the submarine could have imagined. If the Americans could now hear a submarine in the depths of the ocean, how far could this technology go? And how many other submarines were being hunted in the same way, without even realizing it? Up there, in the US Navy plane, the silence inside the cabin was almost as intense as the silence of the ocean below. The radio operator had his headphones pressed against his ears, completely focused. For a few seconds, he heard only the constant sound of the waves and electronic interference. Then came something different, a repetitive, rhythmic, metallic noise, like a distant engine running at the bottom of a tunnel. It was exactly what he expected to hear, the sound of a submarine's propellers. For those who had never heard this type of recording, it might seem like something small. But for those men inside the plane, it meant that the Japanese submarine was still there, moving in the depths. Even without seeing it, they could follow its every movement. It was as if someone were walking in a completely dark house, while another person, upstairs, could identify each step just by hearing the floorboards creak. The operator adjusted the controls and confirmed the reading. There was no doubt. The target was below them. This moment represented something new in warfare. For decades, submarines had been considered ghosts of the ocean. Once submerged, they vanished. Ships and planes might suspect their presence, but were rarely certain of their location. For many submariners, diving was almost like locking a safe. It was protection. It was invisibility. That night, however, the Americans were proving that the ocean was no longer a perfect hiding place. The Avenger pilot received confirmation from the operator. The submarine was below, and the sound of its propellers indicated its approximate direction. The plane began to slowly adjust its position. Down below, inside the I-52, the men probably believed they had escaped. Submariners were trained precisely for this moment. After an emergency dive, the strategy was simple: change direction, reduce noise, disappear into the silence of the ocean. Many crew members must have thought that, in a few minutes, the enemy plane would give up the search. But the plane didn't leave. While the operator continued to hear the noise of the propellers transmitted by the sonobuoys floating in the sea, the Avenger's crew prepared a new weapon. It was something that few militaries in the world knew about at that time. A weapon developed specifically for this type of situation. A torpedo that didn't need direct vision of the target. A torpedo that, instead of seeing, listened. Imagine the situation from the perspective of an average sailor of the time. Many American veterans who served in the war remember that the ocean seemed endless and unpredictable. Ships could disappear into the fog, storms could arise out of nowhere, and the enemy often attacked without warning. But that night, the Americans were transforming that unpredictability into control. For the first time, an airplane could launch a weapon that would literally follow the sound of a submarine hidden on the seabed. When the pilot received the approximate position, he authorized the launch. The weapon fell into the ocean and quickly disappeared into the dark water. From that moment on, control was no longer in the hands of the pilot or the operator. The weapon began to do the work on its own. Its acoustic sensors searched for exactly the same sound the operator had heard in the headphones, the constant noise of the submarine's propellers. Inside the I-52, no one could imagine what was happening. The submarine continued to descend and change direction slowly, trying to remain silent. Perhaps some men were observing the instruments, perhaps others were awaiting further orders. The surrounding ocean was completely dark and seemingly empty. But at some point in that darkness, a weapon was moving towards the sound they were making. Minutes later, the operator on the plane heard something no sailor easily forgets. First came a loud metallic noise. Then a deep explosion sound, transmitted by the sonobuoy. Next, something even stranger, sounds of metal being compressed, slowly cracking as if a huge can were being crushed under pressure. Those sounds traveled through the water and were picked up by the sensors that were still floating on the surface. On the plane, nobody spoke for a few seconds. They knew exactly what they had heard. The submarine had been hit. That audio recording would be preserved years later in military archives, recording the final moments of the I-52. For the Americans, it was more than the destruction of an enemy submarine. It was proof that a new form of warfare had begun. A war in which planes, sensors, and technology worked together to find invisible enemies. For many American veterans who fought in the war, this type of advancement represented something greater than a tactical victory. It represented the ability of American industry and science to completely change the rules of combat. In a global conflict where millions of lives were at stake, every technological innovation could mean the difference between surviving or disappearing at sea. But while the Americans were beginning to understand the power of these new weapons, something even more important was happening silently in the rest of the ocean. Other Japanese submarines continued patrolling. Other crews still believed that diving was enough to escape an enemy aircraft, and this belief was about to be shattered repeatedly in different oceans against different crews, until an inevitable conclusion began to emerge among many Japanese commanders. The ocean was no longer safe territory for them. In the months following the destruction of the I-52, something curious began to happen in the Japanese Navy's reports. Submarine crews returning from patrols reported strange experiences. American planes appeared exactly where they had dived minutes before. Depth bombs fell with frightening precision. In some cases, torpedoes seemed to follow the submarine even when it changed direction. For men accustomed to relying on the darkness of the ocean, this seemed almost impossible. How could the Americans know where a submarine was after it disappeared underwater? The question began to circulate among Japanese officers, and few had a convincing answer. Meanwhile, on the American side, naval warfare was undergoing a silent transformation. The United States wasn't just building more ships or training more pilots. They were creating an entire combat system that connected aircraft, sensors, ships, and submarines in a coordinated network. Patrol planes no longer just flew around searching for something on the surface. They carried radars capable of detecting submarines miles away when they were on the surface. They carried sonobuoys that listened to the seabed, and they carried weapons that reacted automatically to the sound of enemy engines. For the first time in naval history, submarine warfare was ceasing to be a game of hide-and-seek and becoming an organized hunt. But here's an important question that few consider when thinking about World War II. How could a country develop so many different technologies simultaneously in the midst of war? The answer lay in the industrial capacity of the United States. While Japanese submarines were being built one by one in shipyards struggling with resource shortages, the United States was producing equipment on a scale that seemed impossible for its enemies. Factories in dozens of states were simultaneously producing engines, sensors, batteries, radars, and submarine parts. Each new technological advancement could be tested, adjusted, and rapidly distributed to the fleet. For many American military personnel at the time, this was a source of pride. The war was being won not only with courage, but also with science, engineering, and organization. At the same time, Japanese submarines continued to impress those who observed them closely. Some of them were true marvels of naval engineering. Japan had built giant submarines capable of traveling enormous distances without refueling. Some models could even carry small aircraft in internal hangars and launch them into the sea for attack or reconnaissance missions. To any observer, these machines seemed like symbols of technological power. However, there was a detail that was beginning to become evident on the battlefield. While Japan invested in larger and more complex submarines, the United States was investing in increasingly efficient ways to find them. And here another intriguing question arises. What good is having the world's largest submarine if the enemy can hear its propellers from miles away? Many Japanese commanders began to realize exactly this problem during 1944 and 1945. Large submarines produced more noise. Powerful engines created stronger vibrations. In the silence of the ocean, these details could become clues for increasingly sensitive sensors. While Japanese engineers tried to build impressive vessels, American sonar operators learned to identify specific sound patterns. Each class of submarine had a kind of acoustic signature, almost like a sonic fingerprint. For the Americans, this knowledge began to completely change the way naval warfare was conducted. Instead of simply reacting to enemy attacks, the United States Navy began to organize specialized groups called hunter-killer groups. These groups were usually made up of an escort aircraft carrier and several destroyers. Aircraft patrolled large areas of the ocean, launching sonobuoys and using radar. When they detected something suspicious, surface ships were directed to the area. The objective was not only to repel enemy submarines, but to hunt them down systematically. It was a profound change in naval strategy, but consider for a moment the psychological experience of a submariner during that period. Imagine being inside a steel cylinder submerged hundreds of meters deep, without windows, without knowing exactly what is happening on the surface. Now imagine realizing that even down there, the enemy seems to know where you are. Some Japanese accounts from the time describe exactly this feeling. Crews began to speak of planes that appeared as if they could see through the water. For men trained to rely on the silence and darkness of the sea, this was deeply disturbing. As the months passed, the impact of this new reality became evident in the war statistics. American submarines began sinking Japanese ships in ever-increasing numbers. Trade routes that carried oil, food, and raw materials to Japan began to disappear one by one. The Japanese merchant navy, which was essential to maintaining the economy and the war effort, began to suffer devastating losses. In just 1 year, hundreds of ships were destroyed by American submarines. Each ship lost meant less fuel, less food, and fewer resources reaching the Japanese islands. Then another question arises that helps to understand the magnitude of the transformation that was taking place. What happens to an island nation when its shipping lanes begin to disappear? Japan depended on the sea for practically everything: oil from Southeast Asia, food, industrial raw materials. When these ships began to disappear, the impact was immediate. Factories ran out of fuel, cities faced food shortages, and the military effort began to suffer. And while all this was happening, many Japanese submariners began to realize something that was perhaps even more worrying than any lost battle. They were facing an adversary that always seemed to have more planes, more ships, more sensors, and more weapons. Each new patrol revealed more signs that the war was rapidly changing. The issue was no longer just surviving an isolated encounter with an enemy aircraft. The real question was another. If the Americans were turning the entire ocean into a surveillance network, was there still any place where a submarine could actually hide? As 1944 progressed, the war at sea began to reveal a pattern that many Japanese commanders couldn't fully explain. Submarines that had previously patrolled the Pacific with relative confidence began to face an increasingly hostile reality. American planes appeared with unexpected frequency, often exactly where a submarine had submerged minutes before. For those inside those steel hulls, the feeling was unsettling. It was as if someone was watching their every move, even when nothing was visible on the surface. Gradually, accounts began to accumulate. Surviving crews spoke of depth charges dropped with almost mathematical precision and torpedoes that seemed to follow the submarine even after evasive maneuvers. From the American side, the explanation was simple, yet impressive. The United States Navy was integrating technology, industry, and strategy in a way that few military forces had achieved before. Patrol aircraft, such as the Avenger and other models used in anti-submarine missions, began working in direct coordination with escort ships and command centers that analyzed radar and sonar information. It was no longer just a battle of encounters between enemies in the ocean. It was an entire system functioning as a network. Sensors at sea, aircraft in the sky, and ships on the surface shared information almost in real time. For many American veterans of the time, this coordination was a clear example of the organizational and technological capabilities of the United States. Statistics began to show the impact of this transformation. Between 1941 and 1945, American submarines sank more than 1,000 Japanese ships, totaling millions of tons of lost cargo. At some points during the war, the average was almost one Japanese ship destroyed per day. For those watching the events from inside the United States, these numbers were clear signs that the country was succeeding in weakening Japan's logistical capacity. Each sunken ship meant less fuel for Japanese planes, less steel for factories, and less food for the cities. Modern warfare depended on supply chains, and the American strategy was hitting exactly that sensitive point. Meanwhile, many Japanese submarines continued to impress with their size and engineering. Some were enormous by the standards of the time, capable of traveling extraordinary distances and operating for weeks away from any base. There were even submarines designed to carry attack aircraft, a bold idea that demonstrated creativity and technological ambition. On paper, these vessels seemed like formidable weapons. However, on the battlefield, the scenario was different. Large and complex submarines were also noisier and easier to detect by the acoustic sensors that the Americans were rapidly perfecting. American aircraft played a decisive role in this process. They were not only attack platforms, but also observation and analysis platforms. Equipped with radar and sonobuoys, these aircraft could cover vast areas of the ocean in a few hours. In comparison, a submerged submarine moved slowly and had extremely limited visibility. This contrast created a clear advantage for whoever controlled the sky. Many American pilots would later recall that during long patrols, it was possible to deploy several sonobuoys in a suspected area and literally listen to the ocean while the aircraft circled above. It was like setting up an invisible network of microphones in the sea. This technological advantage also reflected something bigger: the industrial strength of the United States. While Japan faced increasing difficulties in replacing lost ships and producing sophisticated equipment on a large scale, American shipyards and factories operated almost non-stop. New submarines, aircraft, and sensors were continuously produced. For many American military officers, this represented the true essence of national strategy, combining human talent with industrial capacity. The result was a military force capable of learning quickly from its own mistakes and adapting its weapons throughout the war. A curious fact, which surprises many viewers when they look at this period, is that some of the first American torpedoes used at the beginning of the war had serious technical problems. Many of them failed or exploded at the wrong depth. However, engineers and crews began to systematically test and correct these problems. Within a few years, new, more reliable versions and completely new weapons were introduced. This rapid learning process helped transform submarine warfare into an area where the United States gained a clear advantage. Meanwhile, for the Japanese submariners, each new patrol became more tense. Some later accounts describe a growing feeling that the ocean no longer offered the same protection as before. American planes were seen more frequently, and anti-submarine attacks seemed more coordinated. The initial confidence that diving meant disappearing began to slowly fade. Instead of invisible hunters, many submariners began to feel that they were being hunted. And there was another unexpected factor that exacerbated this situation. Japan relied heavily on maritime transport to sustain its economy and war effort. When merchant ships began disappearing in large numbers, the impact was immediate. Oil from Southeast Asia ceased to arrive in sufficient quantities. Strategic materials became stranded in distant territories. Some cities began to face shortages of essential resources. Each ship lost at sea meant a direct blow to the country's ability to continue fighting. For many American observers at the time, this scenario confirmed something that would become a central principle of United States military strategy during the Cold War and in the following decades. Controlling the sea and the sky means controlling the flow of information and resources. Aircraft patrolling oceans, sensors listening to underwater movements, and communication networks coordinating attacks were not merely tools of combat. They were signs of a new type of warfare, in which technology and organization could overcome even the most impressive war machines. As 1945 approached, this reality became increasingly clear. The ocean, which had previously seemed an open and unpredictable territory, was beginning to transform into something different. For many Japanese submariners, the question that arose was no longer simply how to successfully complete a mission. The question was far more unsettling. If American planes could hear the entire ocean, how much time was left before every submarine became an inevitable target? In the summer of 1945, as the war drew to a close, an incident in the Pacific definitively confirmed something many Japanese commanders had silently suspected. American technology had completely transformed the ocean into a hostile environment for enemy submarines. The operation began discreetly, almost invisible to those not directly involved. A small group of American submarines received a mission that seemed extremely risky: to penetrate the Sea of Japan, an area that Japanese planners considered virtually impossible for enemy submarines to enter. To understand the importance of this mission, it's necessary to remember that the Sea of Japan was seen as a kind of safe haven for Japanese navigation. Access was protected by extensive fields of sea mines placed in strategic straits. These mines had been positioned for years and formed veritable underwater barriers. For most naval strategists of the time, crossing these regions underwater was considered practically suicidal. A minor navigational error could mean the instant destruction of a submarine. But the Americans were about to test something new. Submarines equipped with an advanced type of sonar began approaching the Tsushima Strait, one of the main entrances to the Sea of Japan. This sonar wasn't just used to detect enemy ships. It was capable of identifying specific submerged objects, including mines. For the American crews, each detected signal appeared as an audible alert on the onboard equipment. Some sailors began calling this sound Hell's Bells, because each ring indicated the presence of a deadly mine just ahead. Imagine the level of concentration inside those submarines as they slowly advanced between the mines. The sonar beeped repeatedly, indicating obstacles just meters away. The operators adjusted their course with extreme precision. In some places, the mines were separated by only 50 meters, a dangerously short distance for a submarine navigating in the absolute darkness of the seabed. Even so, the American submarines continued advancing, guided by technology and extremely well-trained crews. After nearly 20 hours of navigating in absolute silence, the first submarines finally emerged on the other side of the strait. They were in the Sea of Japan. This was an impressive feat. For years, that area had been considered a safe zone for Japanese navigation. Now, suddenly, American submarines were patrolling there freely. Other submarines followed suit in the following days, and soon 9 American submarines were operating in the region. The impact was immediate. In less than 3 weeks, these submarines began attacking Japanese ships sailing in that area, believing they were protected. Cargo ships, military transports, and even escort vessels were surprised by torpedoes emerging from the depths. In total, 28 Japanese ships were sunk during these operations. For the Japanese Navy, the reports were hard to believe. How had enemy submarines managed to enter waters that should have been virtually impenetrable? This episode revealed something that many Japanese officers had begun to realize since 1944. The war at sea was not being decided solely by courage or the size of the vessels. It was being decided by technology, sensors, and industrial capacity. While Japan had invested in impressive submarines and daring projects, the United States had concentrated its efforts on creating integrated detection and attack systems. American aircraft continued to play a central role in this system. They patrolled large areas of the ocean, using radar to locate targets on the surface and launching sonobuoys to listen for underwater movements. When they detected something suspicious, they coordinated attacks with nearby ships and submarines. This cooperation between different military units created a network that covered immense areas of the Pacific. For many military historians, this operational model represented the beginning of modern warfare based on information and technological coordination. Meanwhile, the economic effects of the American submarine campaign against Japan were becoming increasingly evident. At the start of the war, the Japanese merchant navy possessed approximately 6 million tons of cargo capacity. These ships were essential for transporting oil, food, and raw materials from the Asian colonies to the Japanese islands. Over the years, however, this fleet began to dwindle rapidly. American submarines systematically sank cargo ships, disrupting vital trade routes. In 1945, the situation was critical. Much of the Japanese merchant fleet had been destroyed. What little remained sailed with extreme caution, often avoiding long voyages for fear of enemy submarines. The result was a gradual strangulation of the Japanese war economy. Fuel became scarce. Factories began to reduce production. Cities struggled to receive sufficient food supplies. For many American military personnel, this outcome demonstrated something fundamental about the nature of modern warfare. It wasn't enough to win isolated battles. It was necessary to strike at the structures that kept the enemy functioning. By controlling the oceans and destroying supply routes, the United States was weakening Japan's ability to continue fighting. At the same time, technological advancement continued to accelerate. New radars, new acoustic sensors, and increasingly efficient communication systems allowed American forces to coordinate operations across vast areas of the ocean. Aircraft, ships, and submarines worked together as parts of a single system. For many American veterans who served during this period, this cooperation between technology and training represented the true military power of the nation. As the war finally drew to a close, one conclusion was becoming inevitable for many observers. The ocean, which had once been an unpredictable space where submarines could easily disappear, was transforming into an environment controlled by sensors and aerial patrols. The American advantage lay not only in the number of ships or aircraft, but in the ability to transform information into military power. And as this new reality took hold, one last question began to arise among many Japanese commanders still at sea. If the United States could find submarines in the depths of the ocean and penetrate even waters considered safe, then what would be the next step in this technological evolution that was changing warfare before the eyes of the world? As the final months of the war arrived, many Japanese submariners carried a feeling difficult to explain. It wasn't just fear of the enemy. It was something deeper. It was the realization that the battlefield had irreversibly changed. For decades, the ocean had been seen as a place where skill, silence, and courage could guarantee an advantage. Submarines were the invisible hunters, capable of disappearing into the depths and attacking without warning. But now, in 1945, that logic was vanishing before everyone's eyes. With each new American patrol, with each new mission of planes equipped with radar and acoustic sensors, the ocean seemed to shrink for those trying to hide. Planes crisscrossed the sky for hours, observing miles of sea. Sonobuoys listened to the sounds of the depths. American submarines patrolled strategic routes, silently waiting for any enemy vessel. It was as if an invisible net had been cast over the entire Pacific. For many American veterans who participated in these operations, the feeling was clear. They were witnessing a historic transformation. It wasn't just a tactical victory or a specific battle being won. It was the emergence of a new type of warfare, where technology, training, and coordination combined to create a decisive advantage. Many pilots would later recall long nights flying over the dark ocean, observing only the faint glint of the waves while waiting for sensors to reveal something hidden beneath the surface. Meanwhile, for the Japanese crews still navigating in submarines, the experience was completely different. Imagine being inside a steel cylinder at the bottom of the sea, hearing the constant noise of the engines and feeling the pressure of the surrounding water. Imagine knowing that somewhere above, enemy aircraft are patrolling with equipment capable of hearing even the slightest noise your submarine makes. This type of situation creates constant tension. Some accounts from Japanese submariners describe exactly this feeling of permanent surveillance, as if the entire ocean had eyes and ears. But the most impactful moment for many of these men came after the war ended. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, several Japanese submarines were captured or handed over to American forces. Some Japanese officers had the opportunity to see up close the American vessels and equipment they had faced for years. Many were impressed by the level of organization and technology present in these ships and submarines. Some historical accounts tell of Japanese officers visiting American submarines and observing radar, sonar systems, and fire control computers that automatically calculated the best solutions for launching torpedoes. For men who had spent years fighting with simpler instruments and manual processes, this seemed almost futuristic. The contrast was stark. It wasn't just about courage or skill in combat. It was about an entire system built to operate with efficiency and precision. And here comes one of the strongest emotional twists in this story. Many of the most impressive Japanese submarines, those enormous projects capable of transporting aircraft and traveling extraordinary distances, never got to accomplish the grand missions for which they were planned. Some were captured almost intact. Others were examined by American engineers interested in studying their characteristics. And some, after being analyzed, were simply sunk as test targets in the ocean. For those who had invested years of work and hope in these projects, it was a painful contrast. Impressive machines, built with enormous effort, ended the war without having managed to change the outcome of the conflict. At the same time, for the United States, the result represented confirmation of something that many had believed since the beginning of the war. The combination of science, industry, and training could decide the fate of battles and even nations. The ocean, which once seemed unpredictable territory, had been transformed into a field of operations monitored by sensors, aircraft, and communication networks. Submarines were still powerful weapons, but they could no longer rely solely on silence and darkness to survive. Warfare had entered a new era, and perhaps that's precisely why this story remains so relevant today, because it shows something that goes beyond a specific battle or a confrontation between countries. It shows how moments of innovation can completely change the balance of power in the world. It shows how the ability to learn, adapt, and develop new technologies can define the course of history. For many American veterans and for all who study military history, this transformation represents a clear example of what happens when human determination meets scientific knowledge and industrial capacity. It was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration of how a nation can mobilize its intelligence, its industry, and its organization to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. And now I want to hear from you. If this story sparked your curiosity or brought back memories of accounts from family members who served in the armed forces, leave a comment below. Tell us what you thought of this episode from the war and what other historical events you would like to see here on the channel. If you enjoy true stories of war, military technology, and accounts that have marked generations, subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And don't forget to like this video, because that helps the channel continue bringing increasingly in-depth and interesting content. See you in the next video.